This is what we have done last week. We have created this website. And before I go into an overview of what we will be doing in this week, let me do a brief review of what we have done so far. Last week we have gotten familiar with the code itself, with HTML as well as with CSS code, and also with the jargon words that are involved here. That in HTML we are always creating these elements, which are the instructions to the browser relating to our content. And these elements also can have attributes, such as for example an ID or a class, which we then can give a value to, which then allows us in CSS to select our elements, our content, not only by their element type, but also by their class value or by their ID value that we have given them. And this is what we always do in CSS. We select from the content, either here from its type, by its ID or by its class, and then we give our content that we have selected its specifications. And that always includes what we want and how we want it. Always the property and the value, and together this is a CSS rule. And then secondly, what we did last week was having gotten familiar with the structure that always must be there inside an HTML file, which includes that very first line here, the instruction to the browser how to read our HTML code. And this particular instruction says, please read our HTML code, or parse it, that's the perfect jargon word. Parse it as if it was HTML code of version 5 or later. And version 5 is the latest one at the moment. And then we have our root element, the HTML element. And that one is the very first element on our page. It consists of everything else, and that includes two major parts, which is the head and the body element. The head has everything inside it that is for or about our content, and the body is the content itself. It's these elements here are ultimately the ones that will be displayed by the browser in this rectangle here, in this area in which the browser displays the website. And then finally what we have gone over is the server structure that we have on the server, the directory structure, the folders here, that we can create other folders inside our homepage folder for the purpose, for example, of creating sub-pages, and then this subfolder will then always represent another part of the URL, whatever name we gave to the folder, and then once we hit enter, we are contacting now this folder, and the server returns whatever is inside the index.html file that is inside that folder. And we saw that we can also create folders not only for the purpose of creating subpages, but also for the purpose of having a certain structure here on our server to have it a little bit organized. So therefore we created a media folder, and in here come all the things that ultimately will be included or embedded onto our website. Such as, for example, we include ultimately our CSS or images, and we saw that we must always pay attention to the paths, that we specify them correctly. Because once the browser reads the HTML code and it encounters a path, in this case the link path, to fetch the CSS from the server, so it goes to the server and tries to get the CSS, and that path must of course be correct, and we must always pay attention to whether we are on a subpage or on the home page. That always depends how the path ultimately looks like. And we saw that the CSS should always be in an external file. So it is separate from HTML, it can then be cached, stored by the browser, and it can be reused once our CSS code is in an external file. Because we need to reuse a part of our CSS for not only for the homepage but for all subpages. All pages together, they share some appearance for the content, because they are sharing also a little bit of HTML, referring to the major boxes that we have here. All pages, all subpages, including the homepage, are sharing the header, usually the footer box, the main content box, and also usually a couple of boxes that are here inside the yellow box, which ultimately represents the actual information in here that will be there for the particular, in this case the subpage, or in this case here will be the actual information for the homepage. And therefore we can reuse the CSS for all these subpages, for all these boxes, so we don't need to duplicate any code. Ultimately, therefore, our entire CSS for the homepage and all the subpages will be in one single file right in here. And this is what we achieved last week, but what we always will be doing, and what we have done last week, and what we always will be doing in this week, and also in the weeks to come. We will always create content by creating those elements. And then we select the elements, the content, and give that content its appearance. So always create content, select it, and give it its appearance. That's our top overview for HTML and CSS. And giving the appearance to the content can be divided up into giving the content its dimensions, giving the content the positioning where things shall be positioned, and also how things shall be styled in terms of colors, shadows, etc. And ultimately, actually, there's one more category, whether the content and how the content shall be animated, which we are going over towards the end of the HTML and CSS part of this course. And in this week we will concentrate on dimensions completely. We will go over all these properties here, and we will also start to position things using the display property. And we will find out that this is actually the rather tricky part of HTML and CSS. So it's the CSS here, the positioning, CSS positioning of our content. That is rather tricky, and we will find out that HTML is a very simple language. And therefore we will start here. So we will start with the tricky part, and then we will ease out in the end. And we will concentrate today on container boxes once again, because those container boxes, they provide us the structure of the website. Once we have them in place, have given them their dimensions and determined where they shall be positioned, then we just need to fill these boxes with whatever we want within them, and then we are done. This is our website ultimately. And all these properties that we have here, the dimension properties that we will go over today, and any other property that is here, any other, all of them already have a default value assigned to them. Meaning if we use these properties or any of these properties for a certain element, for a certain content or not, they will always have that property with a default value already. So let us go for an example. And let's take a look at our red container box that we have here that represents our header of the website. And that one, background color red, let me now remove it. And now, nevertheless, this container box still has a value for the property background, even though we don't specify anything. Then by default, the value that is then used is transparent, meaning whatever is in the background shines through. And this is not only for the background property, but for any other property that exists. There is always a default value in place. Whether we make use of that property for a certain element or not, it will always have that property with its default value if we don't specify anything else. And now we go into dimensions. Let me first of all get that red background back. And now we go into the default properties, default values that are used for width and height. And we can see here, for example, the text area and the button. They already have a default width and height. And this is even though we don't specify anything. But we will nevertheless concentrate on boxes, because once we understand this for boxes, and also referring to all the other properties that we go over today, once we understood it for boxes, it's clear for the other properties, for the other elements here as well, such as the button and the text area. So let us concentrate on the boxes, and once again let us focus on our red box here, and that one we haven't yet given any width. There is no width here specified for that element, the red one here, the red header container box. Nevertheless, it has a width, and it pretty much stretches from all the way from the left to all the way to the right. And this is because once we don't specify a width, then by default what value is used is the auto value, standing for automatic. So hey browser, do things automatic, and what does that mean? And this is now dimension rule number 1. If we don't specify a width, then the auto value is used, and that means the box will be as wide as the parent. And this is not completely precise, referring to that gap that is actually here right now. And however, to keep it simple, that's our dimension rule number 1 now. If we don't specify a width, it will be as wide as the parent. And who is the parent of the red box? This is where we always indent things to see what is inside what, who is the parent of who. And this is our red box. And its parent is the body. And the body is the entire area that stretches. That's the entire rectangle here in which our content is inside, which we have given a light gray background. And therefore, the red box will be as wide as its parent, as wide as the body, meaning from all the way from the left to the right. And the little gap here I will go over in a couple of minutes. And not only the red box, but also the yellow and the orange box. Same thing for them. We didn't specify a width for them. Therefore, the auto value is used, which means they will be as wide as their parent. And their parent is the body for all three of them. And now let us go into the height. Let me remove the height. And if we don't have a height specified, then once again, same here. The value that is then used is the auto value. And that means, now comes dimension rule number 2, that the height is then determined by the content that is inside it. And right now there is a little bit of text in there, and therefore the height is that much, because the height is determined by the content, by this text that is inside it in this case. Meaning, of course, if I remove this text here, then there is no content anymore in this box, and therefore the box will not have any height. And that is the dimension rule number 2. If we don't specify a height, then the auto value is used, meaning the box will be as high as its content. And now let's go into the sense behind why this is actually the case. Concerning our first dimension rule that the box is then as wide as the parent, this is just because we often want that to happen when we create a container box. Then we want it to be as wide as the parent. It's very often the case. So therefore the browser does this then automatically, the auto value does it, and this is then what usually what we want, and therefore it does it this way. And relating to the height, it's also the case that we often do not know how high our content will be. In particular referring to our yellow box here, because that is where the actual content of, in this case, the homepage will be inside. And let's, for example, assume that this green box represents an article and the blue box as well. Now later we may want to add another article, therefore we are increasing the height. And maybe we don't even want to add an article, but we just want to add further text inside that article, which also increases the height. So ultimately we never know how high our content is. And therefore we just let the yellow box, the height of the yellow box, be determined by the content. It's a very, very useful thing, very often used for the actual information box here, the main box in which the information of that, in this case the homepage, will be inside. Let me go for an example. Our yellow box right now has a fixed height of 300 pixel, which I am now removing, and therefore it will be as high as its content. And once I add another article or 2 or 3, then nevertheless the yellow box will adjust. It will be as high as the content. If I now go to the subpage, because this yellow box is always shared, and now let's take a look at here. Now it's as high as the content. But in this case, because the content of this subpage, for example, is not really very tall, and that doesn't look good anymore if it's too small, this yellow box. There should be a certain height at least. And this is what we can also do by using the minimum height property, min height. So what we are telling here the browser is, be a minimum of 300 pixel, but when the content is higher, then also be higher. So this is what minimum does, and minimum height not only exists for height, but also for width. And there is also a maximum that we can set. So hey, there is a maximum, but I won't go over any further examples here right now, because we need further material to work with, in particular referring to these properties, which we will be going over next week. So I will leave it at here now, but it makes sense that be minimum that high, but if the content is higher, then also be higher. Be minimum that width, if the content is wider, then be also wider. And then the maximum is the opposite. And now we are going into margin. And that is gaps outside a certain element. So we can make a gap, for example, not only on the boxes, same again for any other element, make further space outside the button here towards, on the right, towards the text area, so there is a further gap then. So gap also referring to the outside. So let us now take the yellow box once again as an example. And let me first of all remove 3 of these boxes once again. And now let us give this yellow box on top a gap on top, meaning a margin on the top. So write this property here that we will now be making use of on the yellow box right here. Margin top of 10 pixel, for example. So just the pixel units that we know so far. And here we can see there is now a 10 pixel gap. We may have wondered already why there are so many properties under the topic of dimensions. And this is because that all these properties ultimately determine how much space an element takes up on our website. And margin, if we set a margin on top like we just did on the yellow box, then this gap here still belongs to the yellow box. So this one is still his area. It's still how much space it is taking up, the yellow box. This belongs to him. It's his area. And therefore under here are all the things that ultimately determine how much space an element takes up, which includes the margin as well, the gaps outside the box. Then the gaps inside the box, which we will go over, and the border is also taking part in that as well. And we will start now with margin top, what we have just done with margin. And where there is margin top, where we can set a gap outside on the top, of course we can also do it on any other side, such as the right, the bottom, and also the left, going clockwise now. And right now we have a 10 pixel gap on top, on the right, on the bottom, as well as on the left. And right now we have a particular gap on each side, exactly the same one, 10 pixel on each side. And we can achieve this effect by only using one single line of code instead of using 4 lines of code. By using the shortcut, the shorthander, the margin property, without any top, right, bottom, left, just margin. And then we can specify, I'm now changing it to 20 pixels so we can see the result. But now this 20 pixel is referring to all the sides, top, right, bottom, and left together. So we have achieved the same effect by using one line of code instead of using 4 lines of code, by using this shortcut margin. Now often it is of course the case that the margins, the gap on each side is different, that we want to use a different gap. For example, maybe on top and bottom it's gonna be the same, and on the right and on the left it's also gonna be the same. Top bottom and right left will be the same, but both of them. So right left will be for example 20 pixel and top bottom will be 50 pixel. So if that is the case, then we can still use that shortcut margin, and then we can use 2 values. For example, top bottom, now let me give it actually 50 pixel top bottom and 100 pixel on left and right. So the first value represents top bottom, second one left and right. Now we have 50 pixel top bottom, 100 pixel left and right. And often it is the case that we have individual margins, individual gaps, meaning on top, on right, on bottom and left, they will all be different. And we can still use the shortcut, and that one also exists with 4 values. Let me now insert here 4 values, and this is clockwise again, same as we have done it here. So the first value represents top, then it goes to the right, then it's the bottom, and then it's left. And now we have 5 pixel on top, 10 pixel on the right, 20 on the bottom, and 40 on the left. And in actual fact, it is also the case that sometimes we have different values for top and bottom, but left and right, they will be the same. And this one can also be achieved. This shortcut also exists with 3 values. Let me now give 20 pixel, 40 pixel, and 70 pixel, for example. And in this shortcut with using 3 values, the first value represents top, the second value represents left and right, and the third value represents bottom. And here we see 20 pixel on top, and then 40 pixel for left and right, and 70 pixel on the bottom. So this is the margin property. And margin can also be set negative, even though I don't have an example right now. We need further material to work with. I will go over in the coming weeks where we use negative margins. But for now, just that we know negative margins do also exist. And there is one more value that we can use. In actual fact, we can use any measurement, such as pixels. We will find out later that percentages are also okay. But any measurement, and then the auto value exists as well. So auto. This is the one that we are discussing last. Because now we are going over real examples. Right now, we just use these examples to get used to this property margin. But it doesn't really look good here. So let us get it back to its original. And now let's go for something practical where it makes sense to use margin. First of all, it's that gap here that is always there. There is by default always a gap of around 7 pixel, a margin set of 7 pixel on the body element. And the reason why this is done by default by the browsers is because should there ever be a problem loading the CSS file, then the text is not right at the edge. So to some extent the website is still a little bit better readable. That is the reason behind this gap that always exists here. The margin that is set on the body element by default of around 7 pixel. It depends on what browser we are using. So therefore we let us straight away always reset this to 0. And whenever we are using 0, then of course we don't need any measure, any unit. 0 is always 0, so therefore 0 is completely sufficient. And here we go. Now there is no gap anymore. And the red box, the yellow box, and the orange box now stretch from all the way from the left to all the way to the right. And let's go for other examples where we also use this auto value where it makes sense. On this website, for example, there is a header here as well. The white area is one box. And we can see that there is a gap here, an equal one, and an equal gap here, so on each side. Ultimately causing that content, the logo and that information here, to be centered in the middle. And we can see here there is a straight line. This is really centered everything, the entire website. And this is what we want to achieve right now. And we can do so by creating, first of all, another box inside our header box. And that box we give a margin. Margin is gap outside the box. And we want an equal margin on that side and on that side. So whatever space there is left, then ultimately, because that box we give a specific width, so there will always be, or there will be a little bit of space left. And we want the browser to divide up that space equally by 2, put half of it on that side and the other half on that side, ultimately causing our box to be centered in the middle. And this is done by using the auto value, automatic again, telling the browser do it automatically, divide the remaining gap up by 2 and put each half on each side of the box, outside the box. So again, we are working with margin. And let me first of all create one of those boxes inside our red box. Div, and let me give it ID, header inner container, which is a common way to name it because it's a container that lives inside the other container, so it's inner. And let me target that one with a CSS. And let me give it its specifications. Let me give it its no width now. Let me leave the width out for now so we have a little bit of repetition here. And let me give it a height of also 80 pixels, so same as the red box. And let me give it a background color of light green. So now I have created another box inside the red box. And because I haven't given it any width, therefore, the auto value will be used for the width here, and it will be as wide as the parent. And the parent is the red box, which goes from all the way left to the right, and therefore the green box, which I have now inserted here, will also go from all the way left to the right. And I have given it a height of 80 pixel, and this one is the same height as the red box in the background. But therefore, I can remove the height from the red one, because it will be, if we don't specify a height, it will be as high as the content. And the content is 80 pixel, therefore we don't need that specifications on top there anymore. though we don't see any result yet because I need to give it a fixed width now first of all, so we can see the red box in the background again. Let me give it a width of 960. And here we can see the height of the red container is still 80 pixel, even though we have removed the height there of the red box, because it will be as high as its content, and its content is the green box, which is already 80 pixel, and therefore the red box will also be 80 pixel high. Now 960 pixel is kind of a standard width that is used on websites. Something like 920 to 1000. This is approximately the range which is standard width for websites, and I'm using 960 in this case. And now what we want that box in the center. So there the browser shall take this remaining space here, divide it by 2, half of it shall be on that side, the other half on that side, ultimately causing our green box to be centered. And we are using the margin, and on the left and on the right and on the left we want the auto value to be used. Do it automatically. And on top and bottom, we don't want anything. Therefore, we are using the shortcut with 2 values. Because here top and bottom are represented in the first value and left and right in the second. And now top and bottom we want 0, and left and right we want the auto value, telling the browser do things automatically, and then causing the browser, it will take that space, the remaining space, divide it up by 2, half of it left, right, half of it on the left side. If I decrease my browser window now that remaining space of course decreases. So for example, if a person is using an iPad, for example, so his browser window, when it's open on full screen on his iPad, then he or she may have that look of the website right now. So the remaining gap of course shrinks as the browser window, when the browser window is smaller. And ultimately of course our goal is to have a website that can be viewed on any device, on the smallest screen ultimately up to the largest TV screen. And right now, as soon as we go shorter or decrease the browser window to less than 960, which the green box is wide, then of course the green box starts to disappear right now. And then as larger as we go, the larger is the remaining space, and on each side it will increase of course. So this is how we center boxes horizontally, by using the auto value, and the auto value tells the browser to take the remaining space, divide it by 2, and on each side outside the green box there shall be half of that remaining space. And now let's do this exact same effect on the yellow and the orange box as well. So we ultimately have this effect here of one line. Our website is in one line with a certain width. So the yellow box is right, this one. Let me give it a width of 960 pixel, and let me set it to margin on top and bottom 0, but on left and right to auto. And here we go. And let me now create inside the footer the exact same thing what we have done with the header. Div ID footer inner container, and let me target that one and do exactly the same what we have done with the header. And let me give it a height, let me give it a width of 960 pixel and a height of 30 pixel, which is currently the height of the orange box. Therefore we can remove the height of the orange box, because now its content will be 30 pixel high, so we don't need it anymore because it will be as high as its content. Let me set the margin top bottom 0, left right to auto, and let me also give it a background color, the same one as we used on top. And here we go. Now we have our box here. We have one line as well achieved here. Our website is now laid out in the center. And of course, ultimately, of course, we would remove the background colors here of light green, because all we wanted to achieve, of course, is that the text starts here in one line. But we don't want a different background color here. However, for now, so we can see clearly where the boxes are, let me leave them there for now. So this was the auto value, and we may think, or we may have wondered, that maybe the auto value can also be used not only for left and right, but also for top and bottom. Is that also possible? So let's take a look in there. It doesn't work at all. And the reason comes now. Because when a box, we can see right now by default all container boxes that are siblings. For example, the red, the yellow and the orange box are siblings. They are positioned block by block on top of each other. And so are the boxes, the sibling boxes that are inside the yellow box. Block on top of each other. While other elements are next in one line next to each other. In one line. Instead of being block by block on top of each other. And the browser is a software, of course, only written in code as well. And how the browser achieves this, that container boxes are always block by block, at least by default. And it achieves it because what it actually does. Now this container box, even though it only goes until here, it nevertheless still implicitly, it's indirectly, silently, whatever we want to call it, occupies that area here. And therefore ultimately, because it still kind of indirectly occupies that area, therefore whatever comes afterwards has to move down into the new line. This is how the browser achieves this block effect of having things block by block on top of each other. And therefore, because that area still indirectly belongs to the green box, therefore we can use margin auto on left and right to center it, because it still can make use of that area here, which indirectly still belongs to him, while the area that comes afterwards doesn't belong to him. So using the auto value to vertically align a box doesn't work, because it cannot make use of that area. That is one reason. And another explanation is that we have already seen, that is good to remember and to recall because it will help us later on, is that our code, our website is right now, it's all in the flow. Meaning where the code is, this is where it will be on the website. Our red box comes first, then comes our yellow box, and then comes our orange footer box. Meaning if I take now our red header box out and put it after the main container box, then it will be there. Where the code is, this is where it will be displayed on the website right now. This is, things are in the flow, the code. Where the code is, things are in the flow, that's where things are ultimately. And they cannot be anywhere else. Meaning, if that was possible to auto-align vertically, it just doesn't work, because then things are not in the flow anymore, destroying that logic, how the browser thinks. Things are in the flow. Where the code is, that's where it must be. So this green box can be in the center, but not vertically, because then it just doesn't work. So for these two reasons, two examples, why the auto value cannot be used for vertically aligning boxes, only horizontally. That's what we can, because that area still is occupied indirectly by the green box. Therefore we can bring it to the middle by setting the margin auto on left and right. And same with the green boxes, same explanation there. Let us now continue with our next property, and that is the padding property, which is gaps inside the box now. Now we are inside, not outside anymore. For example, if we wanted that text not to be right at the edge of the box, because right now it's right at the edge, doesn't look too good. So inside the box we can also make gaps by using this padding property. And padding, if we take a closer look, it's from a code perspective, it's exactly the same padding. There's top, right, bottom, left, and also the shortcut that we can use as well with 1, 2, 3 or 4 values. And the only difference in code perspective is that we cannot make use of the auto value, because it doesn't make sense to use the auto value inside the box. There is nothing to divide up by 2 or remaining space or anything, and to center something just doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. But otherwise padding from a code perspective is exactly the same. So let's go for a couple of examples. Let us target our header container here. So we want that text to be further down from the top, so it's not right at the edge of the box. So therefore let us start again with the exact same code that we have started with margin as well. So padding top in this case. And let me use 20 pixel. Now the question becomes, now I have added 20 pixel gap on top of that box here, inside the box. Will those 20 pixel now be added on top of the height, or will they already be included in the height of 80 pixel? Now let's take a look, and right now by default at least it's added on top of it. And this is of course not what we want, because now this causes us, whenever we add a padding, then we need to reset things to 60 in this case to have our original height again. And we never reset this, because there is the property box sizing that is determining whether padding shall always be added on top of the height and the width, or whether it shall always be included. And we want to include it always straight away, so we never need to reset any dimensions, of course. But I will go over that in a second. Just for now, we leave it at our original height that we want and width. We don't change anything anymore. Now let me go to padding on the left side, also of 20 pixel, and here now we see that the width has now increased as well by 20 pixel due to that gap inside the box that we have now inserted here of 20 pixel. And this padding, let me just go for a quick repetition, of course exists for right and bottom as well. And then the shortcut, if we use it for one value only, then this one represents all four sides, top, right, bottom and left. If we use it with two values, then the first value represents top and bottom, second one left and right. So this is vertical, this is horizontal. If we use it with three values, then this one is top, second one is left and right together, and third one is bottom. And then ultimately, if we use it with four values, then it's clockwise. It's top, right, bottom and left. Just as quick repetition, this is not what we are going for now. We are now going for the border, the last property that we are going over. And that one, same effect as padding. It will also be added on top of the height and on top of the dimensions. So therefore, let us first introduce the border. So there is the property border style, border width first of all. So what can we tell, or what can we tell the browser how we want our border? We can determine a width, then how that border shall look like. Shall it be dotted? Shall it be dashed or solid, for example? And we can also determine the color, of course. So these are the three border properties that we are now going over. So a width, first of all, we want, for example, of 10 pixel. And then we have the border style, which is whether we want our border to be dotted, dashed or solid. Let me now go for solid, which is just a straight line, the regular border. And lastly, it's the color. So we can also determine the color of the border, which I will now give a blue color to. And here we can see the border, same thing as with padding. It's added on top of the dimensions, meaning now our box has increased in width and height even further. And this border property once also here has also a shortcut in this direction that we have just introduced it. It's width, style, color. So here we can go, for example, for 5 pixel dotted orange. And because that instruction is coming later than those ones, therefore this instruction is now overwriting all these three, because the browser always reads as we human beings from top left to bottom right, and therefore what comes last will override whatever came before. And here we can see now. So having achieved the exact same result with only one line of code instead of using 3 lines of code. And the border, of course, we can also set for the individual sides separately, such as, for example, border top or bottom, left, right, whatever we want. And then either color, style or width, it's here. So here we can, there's no shortcut for one side only. Here we need to use then border top width, for example. Let me make it 10 pixel. And then, for example, border left style on this, there shall be dashed, for example. And then let me also give it on the right side something different. And this one is color of, for example, green. So individually we can also style each side separately. Here we can see now, here it's green, here it's greater, it's 10 pixel instead of 5 pixel, and here it's dashed instead of dotted. So this is what we can also achieve. And border, same as padding, is added on top of the actual dimensions, added on top of width and height. And this is of course not what we want, because that would cause us to always reset our height and width, which we never do. And therefore we have this property called box sizing, which we are now making use of. And the default value that is used for this property is content box. And in order to understand this default value and the other values that are possible here, let us first inspect the element and introduce the inspector. What we can always do is we can right click on an element and then inspect it, meaning inspect the code for that element. First of all, what we get here is the entire code of our website. Here right now, this is the element that we inspected. And here are the CSS rules for the element, so we can always find out. And in actual fact, let me now, which I only quickly want to show you. We will go over that one in week 5 in more detail. In here, under computed, we can see all browser styles. And here we can see actually that this one element, has all these properties with a certain value. These are the default values used by the browser. So whether we specify a property or not, that element nevertheless has this property with a certain value, a default value. But that's not the topic for now. That box model is actually the topic here. Here we can find out the properties or the box model, the properties, all these boxes here that ultimately determine how much space our element takes up, which is comprised by the content area. Here we can see the shadow once I go over here. This is where the content is inside. The content area or content box. And therefore our default rule here, default value for box sizing is content box, meaning only the dimensions, only the content shall be included in the dimensions, only the content box, only width and height. So padding, which comes here, the padding box or padding area, or border, which comes here, padding or border area or border box, those ones shall be added on top of the content box right now. This is the default. And then comes the margin box, or margin area, which is the area outside the box. And these 4 boxes or areas, they ultimately determine how much space our element takes up on the website, which is better known under the topic of box model, the box model. And if the default value is content box for the box sizing property that determines whether padding and border shall be added on top or included already in the dimensions, then what are the other values most likely? It's padding box, border box, and margin box does exist, but we cannot really use it because only Firefox supports it. But we can use padding box and border box, meaning once I change now here content box to padding box, then the padding will already be included inside the calculations. Here we see, and only the border is now added on top of the dimensions, but the padding not anymore. But of course we want the border as well. So usually we go for that value, we go for border box. So meaning, hey, but browser, include border and padding straight away into the dimension calculation, into width and height. And here's the result. Now perfect. Our box didn't change. It still is in one line here, how we wanted it in terms of its height, in terms of its width. It's still perfect. We never need to reset anything in height and width. It's always included already in the dimension calculations, padding and border. And this we want, of course, not only for that box, but any other box. And that not only boxes, but also the text area or the button. We can also set a border here and a padding. And those ones shall be included always already. We never want to reset any height or width. And therefore, let us introduce a new selector and not do this setting here only on this one single box. Instead, we want all elements to have this setting. And we can select all elements by using the asterisk selector, the star, and then set this here, box sizing, border box, meaning now we never need to recalculate anything, not only for this box, for any other box, and for text area. This setting is always now in place. Padding and border will always be included in the dimensions already. And now, once we saw this, now we can go for the actual dimension rule concerning the width. The width of the container box. Now we always said it will be as wide as the parent if we don't specify a width. but the actual rule is, the actual expression, the actual rule is here, that it will be as wide as the content area of its parent. Because if the parent has a padding, a margin, or a border, then this red box here, for example, if the body element had a margin, padding, or border, then this red box could not go the entire area from all the way left to the right. So the actual rule is, it will be as wide as the content area of the parent. And the height is, if we don't specify a height, the second dimension rule is, then the box will be as high as its content. And now we are going into margin once again. We are going back because there is something that we now can that we can now go over, which we couldn't go over before having discussed padding. And that is the effect of vertical margin collapsing. Meaning, let me first of all create 2 more boxes inside our actual box here. Now let's assume that each of these boxes is representing an article, for example. And we want each article to have a gap on top. And also, so we want a gap here, a gap here, a gap here. Let me first of all remove that one so we can see it better. So we want a gap on top, a gap here, here, and also on the bottom. How can we achieve this? Gaps outside the box are achieved by margin. Now what we could do now, we could set a margin on top. So we can select all these 4 boxes because they are sharing the class child container. So we could set a margin on top of 10 pixel, for example. Then there would be a 10 pixel gap here, 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 and here, but not here. So how can we achieve it? We can set a margin on top and bottom, for example. Then there would be of 10 pixel. Then there would be a 10 pixel gap here. On bottom of the green box would be a 10 pixel as well. But on top of the blue box would be 10 pixel as well, meaning ultimately here would be 20 pixel. And whenever vertical margins, and that only refers to vertical, not horizontal margins, when vertical margins meet, like in this case, there is a bottom margin on that box of 10 pixel and a top margin on that one of 10 pixel. Ultimately, actually would cause that to be 20 pixel. But now comes the effect of vertical margin collapsing. So let me just set a 10 pixel gap on top and bottom of the child containers. Margin of 10 pixel on top and bottom, and left and right 0. And let's take a look. And before I wanted to add a padding, let me quickly do it, of 0.1 pixel 0, which I go over in a second. And here we can see it. There is a 10 pixel gap now here, and no 20 pixel gap here. Instead it's 10, because these margins that meet here, the 10 pixel from bottom of this box and the 10 pixel from top of that box, those 2 times 10 pixel, they are merging into each other. And it's always the larger margin will ultimately prevail. And in this case, both of them are 10 pixels, so one of them prevails only, and ultimately there will only be 10 pixel and not 20 pixel margin. And the reason why this is the case, why the browsers behave in this way, is that we then have already our nice structure here, like we wanted it, without having to go into other options that we actually have, which we haven't yet gone over. So what we actually could also do is we can select the green box, the yellow box. So we can set only a 10 pixel margin on top, which will ultimately cause that to be no margin on the bottom here. But we can then select only the last box and then set a 10 pixel margin there. So this would also be possible. But the browsers are behaving like this since the early days, and so we already have this without having to go into any further selections. It's already nicely divided up. This is the idea behind vertical margin collapsing. However, this vertical margin collapsing has a side effect. And this is the reason why I have added a padding on the yellow box. I have added a padding on top and bottom of the yellow box of 0.01 pixel, meaning a very, very tiny one which cannot really be seen. And that padding is providing a barrier, because otherwise the most top margin, meaning that one of the most top box here, that one, and the most bottom margin, meaning this one, they would otherwise travel propagate to the parent and be applied on the parent. And that is a side effect I cannot give you the sense for, only the solution, because I don't know. So should you ever find out the sense behind this, I'm interested as well. I assume it's just a side effect that's been there from the beginning and it's too far rooted in the browser, so they are not changing it anymore. That's my assumption just. But here we can see it. Now the most top margin that we actually set on top of the green box, and the most bottom one which we actually set on the bottom of the blue box, now traveled to the parent. It propagated up to the parent. It traveled to the parent and got applied on the yellow box outside here. And we can prevent this side effect from happening by setting a barrier. Hey, you cannot travel up to the parent, by, for example, setting a padding. We can also set a transparent border, for example. And there are two other options as well, but padding is a good one. So let's stick with that one. From what we know so far, we can set a padding here, causing a barrier to exist here, kind of, hey, stop, you can't go there. Causing that most top and most bottom margin not to travel up to the parent and be applied there. So this is the side effect. This is vertical margin collapsing, that we must consider that this is how the browser behaves, and only referring to vertical. So when we add horizontally a margin, doesn't matter. Only vertical. This is vertical margin collapsing. And this is it now. This is our dimension properties. Everything that needed to be discussed has now been discussed here. And now we are going into the display property. What we now want is, we want two boxes next to each other. First of all, let me remove the entire vertical margins here that I have set. And let me also remove two of the boxes once again. And here we go. Now we have our two boxes here, and those two boxes we want next to each other. For the reason, because both of these boxes ultimately will represent a column of our website. Because every website not every, but most of the websites are made up of columns. And this is where we now take a look at, what we now take a look at right here. For example, this one here, let me just mark it. So there is one, oops, that's not the right one. Let me go for this one. So there is one box, kind of the yellow box that we have, and in there will be two other boxes, which we can see there is a line dividing the two columns up. So it's going actually all the way down, but I can't draw and scroll at the same time. So here are two boxes next to each other, meaning this is here right now, this is a two column layout. Column 1, column 2. Let's go for another website here, for example. Same thing here. It's a two column website. So we have one box entire, and then we have two other boxes in here that are next to each other. So two columns here as well. And now you may wonder, isn't it possible to only create the columns without having to have an entire box first? Only the two columns here without having an entire box, and inside there shall be the two columns. It's absolutely possible, but I would not recommend it, because then we do not have control over the entire area at once. By creating a box here for the entire area, meaning we can then select this entire area with CSS and have control of its appearance of the entire area at once. So I would recommend to always use a box first to represent the entire area, and then in there come two columns, two other boxes that will then be next to each other. And in this case, for example, we have three columns. So here, without marking it now, this is column 1, this is column 2, and here we have column 3. Or on this page, for example, which can clearly be seen, column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4 even. And this is how websites are made up, at least the area in which the actual information for a certain website, for in this case the homepage, is inside. This area is made up of columns. So therefore what we want that blue box next to the green box. And therefore this green box will now give up its area that it indirectly occupies. It indirectly occupies this area, which therefore allowed us to use margin auto on left and right, because it can still use this area, and therefore we could center this green box in the middle. But once we once we now get this blue box up, then the green box gives this area up to the blue box. And therefore we cannot use margin auto on left and right anymore. So this one becomes then not possible anymore. We cannot horizontally center something with the auto value anymore, margin auto on left and right. Because this area, the green box, now gives up to the blue box. And we get this one, the property in charge here is the display property. And once again, we can see boxes that are siblings are always block by block on top of each other. And while other elements, they are in line next to each other already, in one line. So, and the property in charge here, let's go for it and let me target both of these boxes, and which are child containers. And the property in charge here is the display property. And this one by default on container boxes is block, causing them to be block by block on top of each other. And now we want them to be in the same line next to each other. And therefore we are using inline block nevertheless. So it's kind of a hybrid thing, which is the question, why is it hybrid? Why aren't we just using inline? No, it's the exact opposite of block. Hey, be inline. Instead we are using this hybrid thing. And the reason for this is, I need to explain this, I need to reach out a little bit further. Let me add some text here. Add some text. And let's assume that we only wanted to have that one word, some, to have a background color, but not the other text. What do we always do if we want to give our content its appearance? In CSS, we always select the element and then give it its appearance. But right now, what do we have here? We only have text. There is no element. Therefore, the first thing that we need to do, we need to wrap only this one word in between an element. And therefore, we can then target the element and give it a background color. And this word will then be inside that element which we have given a background color to, and therefore only that word will have that background color. So therefore let me wrap this one word only in one element, and what element will we be using? Now the div is not possible. I mean, we could use it, of course. Let me now go for a div, but a div element is by default display block, meaning ultimately causing the sum to go into the next line. So therefore the div is display block by default. So we need another element here. And therefore let me introduce a new element for today, and the only one for today, which is the span element. This is a text element which is not display block, but it is display inline by default. Meaning that value inline is already in use for all text elements. All text elements are always display inline. And the reason is to follow in a second. So let me change it from a div to a span here first of all. Now I could give that one an ID if I had more spans on my website, therefore to target it individually, but for now it's the only span. So let me target it by its type. And it's in the header, so let me go up to the header. It's right in here. Target the span and with the curly brackets, and let me give it a background of gray for example. Oops. And here we go. Now our result has been achieved. And the sum did not move into the next line because the span element is not display block, which always causes to be in a separate line. Instead it is display inline, and not inline block, inline. And what is the difference between inline and inline block? And that's what we find out now. Let me give that one a width, our span as well, of 1000 pixel and a height of 200 pixels, so quite large. And there is no effect, because inline elements cannot have a width, nor can they have a height, because all text elements are inline elements, and text shall always be in one line. And once we give it a height, then it will not be in line anymore. Therefore, we cannot give it any dimensions. Text shall always be in the same line in order that it is readable. Therefore, this value inline is already taken. It's used for all the elements that are text elements. And because text elements shall be in one line, they cannot have any dimensions. And this is the reason why we are using this hybrid value in order to bring any other elements that are not text elements, such as container boxes, such as a button, or such as a text area. They are all inline block, meaning they are in line, ultimately in the same line, but still block, meaning they can still have a width and a height inside them. So if I want that span here to have effect, that width and that height, I could still change the display value from inline to inline block. It's still possible, and then the width and height has actually an effect. But that is not the original idea behind text elements, because text elements shall always be in the same line. And the span element is one of those text elements and is only used to add some appearance to a certain part of text. This is when we use the span element. And it's a text element used to give only a specific portion of text its specifications, because we cannot target a specific portion of text, such as only this one word. We always need to wrap it around an element, and we need a text element, which is the span. That is an element that is then or can be used, and which we will see later why there are so many other text elements available actually here. So text elements are inline, and if we want any other element apart from text to be inline, we use inline block, because those elements we want to have a width and a height still. Inline elements cannot have a height and a width. Inline block elements can have a height and a width. But both of them are ultimately inline, in the same line. And these are inline level elements. Inline level, they are inline level positioning, inline level elements. And this is a jargon word that that I suggest us to keep as well. They are inline level positioned, inline level elements. While any other elements that's on top of each other are block level elements, block level positioned. And let us now go over that text here and take a look how margin and padding are actually affecting this one. So height and width do not have any effect on our span, because it is display inline. Now let's take a look how padding is affecting that box. So let me give it a padding of 20 pixel, for example, and it will still apply the padding. So there is a 20 pixel gap, but we can see the text is still in the same line. It will still not move away. So actually what actually should happen here, it should actually move away. So there is a different behavior on padding that takes place here, because it wants always the text to remain in the same line. And same relating to margin. The margin has no effect either. So once again, the shortcut with one value refers to all sides, top, right, bottom, and left. So 20 pixel. Now the top and bottom didn't get applied at all. Left and right did get applied, causing the text to still be in the same line. So this is what inline elements are. These are text elements, never causing the text to move away from the line. And then we have the inline block elements right here. And irrespective, all inline elements, whether they are inline or inline block, they are ultimately treated by the browser as if they were text. And this is why we have a gap in between here, and a gap in between the button and the text area, because the browser now treats these elements, each of them, as if each of them was one word, consisting of one single letter. So each of them is one word. And what the browser always does with our text, it always removes all white spaces by default, apart from one. So the text does not move on top of each other. So it keeps one white space in between the words. And now, because these elements here that are once they are next to each other, are treated by the browser as if they were words, this is why it keeps now a white space in between these elements. So what we currently have here is, here, there is one white space in between. So how do we remove the white space? Same as with text. We just say, hey, this is one word, not two. Then the white space is gone. And same here now for the elements. Not text, because the elements are now treated as words, each of them. and we can remove that white space by bringing those elements together, therefore manually removing that white space, telling the browser, hey, this is actually one word. Even though it's two boxes, but the browser thinks now this is one word. So this is how the browser thinks. This is something that we need to know, because this is the topic of next week that we will discuss. Next week we will go into inline level positioning, meaning these properties can only be applied to inline level elements, to those elements that are next to each other, whether they be text elements with display inline, or whether they be any other element with inline block that can still have a width and a height. Any element that's next to each other can make use of these values here. And we will also go into the overflow property, where we can, which is directly related to white space, for example, which we will see next week. So this is therefore important to understand. What we always usually do here, instead of having both elements then in one line, so one option that we that is usually done is breaking things here. So there is still no white space. The browser still thinks there is no, it's still one word, but now we have both elements in a separate line, which makes it much nicer to overview our code. Another option that we have, I quickly want to show, is we can leave it this way, and we can use comments as well, because whatever is inside comments will be ignored by the browser. So meaning everything will be ignored until here, and then there is no white space either in between the elements, meaning there won't be any white space either here. So this is another option that we have. And all we needed to do now is make these boxes, give them a certain width, and then ultimately both of these boxes represent a column for our website, meaning we have then a 2-column layout. So let me just do this for a second, and let me hereby use the chance and also introduce a new measure, a new unit, measuring unit. Instead of calculating now, oh, okay, this yellow box is 960 pixel, so I make this one maybe 700 and this one 260, which in total is 960, therefore it makes up the entire area. And what we can also do is percentages. So just that we know that this is also possible to do, let me go to our child container here. Instead of using a width here, let me give it a width of 75%. And the other box, the blue one, let me give a width of 25%. And here we go. And all we needed to do now, instead of giving the minimum height to the yellow box, we give the minimum height to both of these boxes, which share the class child container. So minimum height. So this one we can remove. And here we go. So now this is our 2-column layout here. One thing we should pay attention to, or we should consider or be aware of, is that, for example, if we now didn't take that white space, if we didn't remove it, and this box was 75% in this case, and this one 25, which is a total of 100, plus a white space, meaning the blue box doesn't have space here anymore. And once there is no space, of course, then it moves down. It's nevertheless an inline level element, because it would like to be there, but it just can't because there is no space. So once we don't remove the white space, then the blue box doesn't have space anymore, because we are exceeding the 100%, 75%, 25% plus the white space. And also now, as soon as I remove the text of the blue box, what actually happens, the green box moves down. And that behavior we are discussing next week, why this is actually the case. So for now, that's it. We are not going further into detail. We actually have control over it by vertical align if we already want to take a look at it, but we will discuss it next week. Also, what I already mentioned is margin zero order cannot be used anymore once elements are next to each other. And also our first dimension rule changed, because our first dimension rule was the width. If we don't specify a width, then the container box will be as wide as the parent. And this is not the case anymore, because it cannot use this area here. Same reason. Cannot go any further here, because now there is a blue box, it now has a neighbor. And therefore there is a new rule in place now. So let me therefore remove the height and the width for a second. The minimum height first of all here. then it will be as high as the content. This rule didn't change if we don't specify a height. But if we don't specify a width for the green one, for example, then it will be as wide as the content as well. So same rule applies here now for the height as for the width. Once boxes are in line, or once elements are in line next to each other. Once container boxes are in line next to each other. So this is it for now. 2 more tools I want to give you in case you want to use them. Let me first of all get it back to a little bit normal. This is first of all the measurelt, which allows us, it's a Firefox extension. I think it exists also for other browsers. But here, if we ever wanted to measure something on a website, it's quite, in my opinion, it's a handy tool. So to quickly identify the width and the height of something. And this one is this extension here. Of course, a link to here is always depending where we are watching this video, either underneath the video in the description or in the notes itself. And another tool I want to go over is one thing that I forgot last week, a good shortcut that exists actually, and that is we can duplicate a line of code by going with the mouse with the cursor on that line of code and then using Control Shift and then arrow key up or down, which automatically duplicates the code, which is a tremendously useful thing. Also, we can just mark that code and then we can duplicate it using Control Shift and arrow keys again. So very, very handy. And just if it helps, of course, completely dependent on what keyboard we are using. So it's Control, Shift, and then the arrow keys together, so which are not even indicated here. And either the top arrow key up or down, together with Control Shift. And in order, this inspector that we learned about, this inspector, this can also be opened by using a shortcut, and that is Control Shift and Q together. So the shortcut for this one. And once we have opened that inspector, usually I prefer to have it in a separate window, but by default it's actually on the bottom of the existing window. So here we can determine this. So whether we want things on the right side or completely separate in a separate window, which I usually prefer, but it's a preference thing. And this is it. So next week, once again, it's inline level positioning. Only inline level elements can have these properties, and we will go into overflow, meaning when content is larger than the box in which the content is inside, then things go over the box. They overflow. So this is what overflow means. And in here we have our, if we are using this CSS file, this is where we are currently at. So in terms of HTML, we only introduced the span today. In CSS, we went over all dimensions and display. And then here is the detail. So should we ever forget what was margin once again? Margin with 3 values, for example. So we can always search here margin, which I just misspelled while searching for it. So here 3 values. It's top, then the second value stands for right and left and bottom. So here is always the detail, and here are the notes, including the link to the ruler, the measurelt extension that I just mentioned. So until next week.